So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the utility of examining state policy. And this is really one of the central premises of the book that Joni Finney and I had released in April on state policy. So this slide gives you a sense. I've been indicating to you and arguing that place matters. So here you get a sense, I hope, of the variations in educational attainment based on the state in which folks live. So at the high end of the continuum, more than 45% of adults have at least an associate's degree in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. At the other end of the continuum, less than 30% of adults had at least an associate's degree in Mississippi, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arkansas, and West Virginia. So quite a variation. Those, yeah, right. So what do we know about the role of state policy in improving higher education attainment? So I mentioned Joni Finney. Before Joni, so Joni's a colleague of mine at Penn GSE. Before she joined us, she was the vice president at the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education. And one of the things that the National Center did was it released measuring up every 2 years from 2000 to 2008. I think that measuring up was a really important mechanism for changing the conversation and really changing our focus to really point to the role of states with regard to improving higher education attainment. So measuring up was a series of report cards that essentially graded each state on measures of college preparation, participation, completion, the benefits of higher education, and affordability. Measuring up told states about how they were doing on those indicators, and it provided trends over time and how states were performing. One thing that it didn't do, though, was explain, well, why? So why do some states get higher grades or lower grades than others, and why do some states improve and other states decline? And so those questions, trying to understand the how and the why, underlie our book. And so the central question that we were looking at was, how does a state with particular economic, political, historical, and educational context improve its educational attainment and close gaps in attainment across groups? And our particular focus was on public policy. So in terms of what we did, just very briefly, we did case studies of 5 different states: Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Texas, and Washington. We collected a whole host of different types of data. We spent time in each state. One of the interesting things that influenced our results is, and for those of you who are doing research design classes right now, history mattered, I think. So we were collecting data in the height of the economic downturn. It seemed like every time we were in the state capital of one of these places, there was a new dramatic headline about the most recent budget cuts that the state was trying to face. And so that was an important element of context for us. We talked to a whole bunch of different people, leaders of the higher education associations, people in the legislature, the governor's office, presidents of universities, folks on the K through 12 side. I think our research builds on, there's a number of different types of studies in this area that I can talk more about if you're interested in another time, just in the interest of time now. Our states, so one question you may have is, why did we select these states? So we tried to select states that varied in a number of important ways. So they vary in terms of their performance, their higher education performance, and their trends in attainment over time. They also vary in terms of their demographic characteristics. So we wanted to select states that were diverse in particular characteristics. So Georgia and Maryland have high percentages of their population that are African American. Texas, high percentage of its population is Hispanic. Illinois really mirrors the national average. Washington, less diverse in terms of blacks and Hispanics, but growing Hispanic population. We also wanted to have states that had different configurations of their higher education systems, but we also wanted to be sure to include states that had large enrollments in community colleges, given our focus on trying to improve attainment for students from historically underrepresented groups. And we also, one of the things that we've tried to do as we wrote up our study was take into account the economic context. So, I mentioned that we were collecting data during the economic downturn, and so a lot of the folks that we talked with, especially from the state policy perspective, emphasized that, it's just such a dire situation with the recession. One of the things that we try to point out is that the problems with regard to educational attainment and the gaps in attainment across groups were happening before the economic downturn. right? So some of the challenges were exacerbated by the constraints in fiscal resources. The other important issues that with structural budget deficits, and so that's what this slide describes, structural budget deficits. There's not going to be a lot more money available unless we decide to increase taxes and things like that to fund things like higher education in the coming years. So and that foreshadows one of our conclusions about this, about the importance of thinking about the resources that we do have. So this slide gives you a sense of the stories that we found in the 5 states. So in Georgia, and I'll just tell you a little bit. So Georgia, the headline for us was perpetuating disparity. So Georgia, below average on most measures of higher education outcomes, and considerably lower performance for the large Black and growing Hispanic population than for the white population. In Georgia, one of the things that we point to are essentially the regressive higher education financial aid policies. So many of you may be familiar. Anybody from Georgia here? Yes. So the Hope Scholarship Program, regressive policy awards financial aid based on academic merit, and when policies are rewarding academic, we know the positive relationship between income and traditional measures of academic achievement. In Georgia, there was also and is a high production of workforce certificates by the technical colleges, but at the time of our study, weak policies for enabling students who start in the extensive technical college system to transfer into degree granting programs. In Illinois, a story of decline. So Illinois was a top performing state in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, and then had sharp declines at the time of our study. So one of the things that we point to and think about is the change in the governance structure of higher education. So in the early 1990s, Illinois had a system of systems that served to help coordinate and really speak to a public agenda for higher education in the state. And over time, the dismantling of the system of systems gave much more local control to the institutions. And one of the findings from our study, or one of the recommendations is the priorities of colleges and universities are not necessarily the priorities of the state, right? They're different preferences that play out. There was also an unraveling of some of the strategic finance policies. So Illinois had a very well-regarded need-based financial aid program in the early 1990s and experienced some challenges in continuing to fund that to meet the need of all students moving forward. Maryland, much accomplished, much at stake. So Maryland was our relatively high performer, but still considerably lower performance for the African Americans and white residents of the state. Trying to figure out in Maryland questions about one of the historically Black colleges, in particular Morgan State University. In Maryland, it was so trying to figure out what works is challenging. So Maryland's a small state. It has a strong tradition of political leadership for higher education. But one of the positive things is that they have a comprehensive plan for financing higher education going forward. In Texas, hard choices ahead. So one of the strengths of Texas, and I think this may reflect in part the demographic characteristics of the population, is the real consensus that there is a need to improve higher education performance, especially for the lower performing groups. Their master plan was called Closing the Gaps, and they were regularly assessing progress towards achieving the benchmarks that had set. One of the challenges that we point to is, at the same time as there's extensive attention to closing the gaps, there's also important goal of trying to increase the research mission of some of the research universities in the state. And so we just raised the question, when resources are finite, what are the trade-offs of allocating money to increasing attainment versus increasing the research capacity of your research universities that may not serve the same populations? And then Washington was state policy leadership vacuum. And so one of the issues in Washington is there's very high completion rate for folks who enter the public four-year institutions, but relatively small share of students enter those institutions. And when you think about some of the big employers in Washington, so a high need to increase bachelor's degree production there. And so it's just one of the, right, and so a number of issues going on there with regard to the role of community colleges versus the four-year institutions in the state. So one of our challenges in the in the book, and for those of you who do qualitative research, is trying to figure out, well, those state stories are so different. What are the themes that cut across those? Are there some lessons that we can be learning more broadly? Here's a picture of the lessons a picture that we tried to develop to summarize those lessons. So really this model has 5 underlying tenets. So one is that the context matters. This is at the foundation of the model. In order to understand what sorts of public policies are going to improve attainment, there has to be consideration of the historical, economic, political, cultural context, as well as the characteristics of the higher education system. A second premise of this work is that we identified 3 categories of policies. So again, we didn't want to come up with any particular type of policy recommendation, but really pointing to the categories of goals that we're trying to achieve with our policies. So one has to do with the strategic use of fiscal resources to improve college affordability. And essentially this is related to the ways in which the fiscal levers that are available to a state policymaker come together to shape affordability. And so those levers include public appropriations, so appropriations to institutions in the state, who has tuition setting authority, and the financial aid policies in the state. And affordability is really determined by how those things come together relative to family income. Public policy, like research, tends to emphasize or look at one of those things, each of those things in isolation, right? And so what we're trying to stress is to look at how they come together. And of the 5 states, Maryland has made some progress in trying to think about those things, those different levers together. A second category of policies has to do with the preparation and movement of students. So, the extent to which students are able to move from K through 12 into higher education. I showed you the slides on developmental education. We are losing students there. In all 5 of our states, they have had, like many states, at one time some sort of P20, P16, some sort of entity that had been established. But even with that ostensible organizational structure, still more need for policy to think about how we can ensure that students actually are able to navigate that transition. There's also transition issues with regard to the movement of students once they enter higher ed. So many students don't attend just one institution, they transfer from one institution to another. And the extent to which students are able to navigate that transition and not lose academic credit is a real problem in many states, certainly in the 5 states we looked at. That third category has to do with the optimization, what we call the optimization of system capacity. And so all 5 of our states, to some extent, are trying to figure out how to meet the educational needs of its population with the higher education resources that it has available. So I mentioned before Washington State's issue with regard to increasing bachelor's degree attainment. Washington has a relatively small number of public 4-year institutions, and they're not necessarily located where the population is, right? So, and it has an extensive system of community colleges. So the challenge is to try to figure out, well, how can they improve bachelor's degree attainment given this extensive community college system? So one of the issues has to do with transfer. Washington also was allowing some of its 2-year colleges to award applied baccalaureate degrees. And so there are a lot of strategies that are being adopted that raise questions that have some potential strengths and potential worries that we should be thinking about. So underlying that, those 3 categories of policies is the role of state policy leadership. And what we argue here is that, let me just skip ahead. What we argue here is that all states have policies, right? So it's not like we're making these recommendations where nothing is going on. The challenge, I think, is to try to ensure that these policies are oriented towards achieving a particular goal. And what we argue is the importance of the goal of improving attainment and closing gaps in attainment across groups. We also emphasize the role of steering. And so I think that one of the issues going on right now is just the relative role of institutions and state government in determining issues like tuition setting and other types of outcomes that are important to attainment. If I were going to draw the picture over, I would figure out a way to make equity more of a transparent part of the model. But a clear conclusion from our study is that The policies that we have in the agenda, the public agenda, has to be oriented toward improving equity. So a state's failure to ensure that college is affordable, to ensure that all students are academically prepared, to ensure that students have high quality higher education outcomes and so high quality post-secondary options. A failure to do those things disproportionately impacts those who are now not well served by our higher educational system. I just want to say a word about other types of policies and practices. So state and federal policy clearly matters, but there's also other players in this puzzle that are important to consider, and all have an obligation, I think, to pay greater attention to improving attainment. So, as I've been trying to emphasize, we need a comprehensive approach that recognizes the roles and responsibilities of different players. K through 12 districts and schools have to ensure that students can have access to academically rigorous courses and provide the supports necessary for all students to succeed in the courses. We also have to think about the ways that we can help students successfully navigate both the college choice process and the student financial aid system, given the constraints on the availability of people, counselors. So technology, many people are pointing right now to the role of technology in helping with that information-related component of the college-related transition. That being said, though, converting information, so I think we've done a lot of good work in putting information out there. How we convert information into knowledge that folks can use to actually make good decisions is harder. So I think that's an area where we need more attention. We also need greater action from colleges and universities. Clearly, the low completion rates that I showed you are important to be paying attention to. We need to somehow ensure that all students have the knowledge, the resources, the support that they can actually finish the programs that they enter, especially when we're relying on loans to finance higher education. I think there's an important issue there with the amount of risk that we're putting on students when we don't provide the supports that they need in order to finish their programs. There are also a whole lot of other organizations in this space, college access related organizations. Even if we solve the academic readiness and the financial resources problem, I think that there's still going to be some students who are going to need that additional support. So I see a continued role for those types of organizations moving forward. And clearly right now, with so many students who are not well served by our current system, those organizations are really important. Okay, so clearly there are many challenges to improving higher education attainment and closing gaps. As Martin Luther King stated in 1964, quote, "I would like to use as a subject from which to speak tonight the American dream. And I use this subject because America is essentially a dream yet unfulfilled. The substance of the dream is expressed in some very familiar words found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the dream." So we've made some progress since 1964, but 50 years after the march from Selma to Montgomery, we know that there is more progress that's required to achieve the dream and ensure that all students have the opportunity to access and succeed in higher education. The need to create meaningful improvements in higher education attainment is more important now than ever before, harking back to those increases in benefits that I showed you at the beginning. So whether we're researchers, policymakers, practitioners, parents, caring adults, I think we all have an important role to play. So thank you. Look forward to the conversation.